The theater of vulnerability. There are rules to the human condition that are so fundamental, so subterranean, they operate beneath the level of conscious thought. We call this power, but it is rarely about brute strength or accumulated wealth. It is the physics of influence, the subtle, pervasive energy exchange that determines who listens, who submits, and who wins the critical, silent debates that occur every time two people meet. You are settling in now, the noise of the day dissolving into the quiet hum of introspection. This is the perfect time, perhaps the only time, to study these silent rules. While the body relaxes, the mind is finally free to engage with the uncomfortable architecture of strategy. We are not looking for self-help, we are conducting psychological cartography. We are mapping the territory of manipulation and influence, understanding its mechanics not to deploy them maliciously, but to see them clearly when they are deployed against us. You already know many of these rules instinctively, but knowing them explicitly changes the game entirely. The key question we must address tonight is this: if strategy is merely a refined form of self-protection, how can you ever tell the difference between a genuine connection and a calculated risk assessment? That boundary is what we seek to define. This leads us directly to the first silent rule of influence, the theater of vulnerability. Perhaps the most potent strategy deployed in the architecture of human relationships is the weaponization of the delicate. You likely believe that true strength lies in hiding your flaws, in presenting a polished, impenetrable facade. But why is it then that the moment you strive hardest to appear invulnerable, you suddenly feel the most exposed? The true insight lies in recognizing that in the modern social contract, vulnerability is no longer a liability. It has been meticulously repositioned as a resource. The theater of vulnerability is the concept that the conscious, controlled display of weakness or perceived fault, the confession, is in fact an advanced technique of control. It operates on the ancient primal code that when someone shares a flaw, they are simultaneously signaling two powerful messages. First, that they trust you enough to share it, and second, that they are temporarily disarming themselves, rendering them safe. Think of the central illustration, the deliberate creation of the relatable flaw. It's not the profound, dark secret that gets disclosed. It's the small, self-deprecating anecdote, the curated story of a minor struggle, or the manufactured moment of self-doubt inserted into a narrative of ambition. The goal is not honesty. The goal is adjacency. By displaying this controlled wound, the performer, and yes, we are all performing, achieves immediate psychological gravity. They pull you in because you recognize the imperfection. You feel safe enough to lower your own defenses, believing you have found a fellow flawed human rather than a strategist. But the mechanism is insidious because it exploits our need for authenticity. When someone offers up a vulnerability, our inherent bias is to believe this disclosure is genuine and therefore proof of their good intentions. We confuse transparency with truth. The moment you witness the deliberate, well-timed sharing of a deep struggle, you rarely stop to ask, why now? And what is the desired return on investment for this emotional capital? The paradox here is sharp. Real, uncontrolled vulnerability is often met with dismissal, discomfort, or outright exploitation. If you genuinely break down, if your weakness is truly raw and messy, society tends to back away. We respond best to curated pain. We invest our emotional resources only into the wounds that have been nicely framed and hung on the wall of the narrative. The strategist understands that the audience will always applaud the hero who momentarily acknowledges their human limits, especially if that acknowledgement makes the audience feel superior or safer in their presence. Consider how this plays out in the professional sphere, or even on a first date. The high-powered executive who confesses, "I'm terrible at work-life balance, I just care too much," is deploying a vulnerability that doubles as a brag. The person on the dating app who says, "I'm terrible at small talk because I value deep connection," is preemptively insulating themselves against superficial judgment while simultaneously elevating their perceived character. These aren't weaknesses, they are strategically placed lures. They are designed to elicit nurturing, validation, or the precious gift of relaxed skepticism. When you observe someone opening their personal vault just enough to let you peek at one small authorized item, they are not giving you access. They are granting you a brief, managed experience of intimacy. They are, in effect, securing power by proving they don't need it. They earn your trust by demonstrating they are willing to risk its loss. It's the oldest trick in influence. You surrender a small, expendable piece of control to gain influence over the much larger narrative. The psychological impact of recognizing the theater of vulnerability is profound. It doesn't make you cynical, it makes you precise. It forces a recalibration of your trust metric. You stop assessing people based on how much they reveal and start assessing them based on the context of why they revealed it and what they immediately asked for in return, even if that return is just your lowered guard. The silent rule is this: never mistake the performance of vulnerability for the state of being vulnerable. The former is a calculated approach to power acquisition. The latter is simply being human. The curtains never truly close on the performance. They only momentarily dim while the actor adjusts their mask. This recognition is the foundation of all subsequent insights. You are listening now, and the lesson has begun. The physics of reciprocity. We move now to the most fundamental, inescapable rule governing human transactions, the physics of reciprocity. It's not a polite suggestion. It is a psychological law, as consistent and predictable as gravity itself. It defines the invisible framework of power, dictating who owes what and when the payment is due. Have you ever felt that invisible pull, that slight, unsettling obligation after someone has done you a small favor? It's a quiet discomfort, a tension in the periphery of your mind that whispers, payment is due. This tension is the kinetic energy of reciprocity activating within your subconscious. It is why true social independence is so rare. We are all interconnected by these unseen chains of debt. Even when you are alone in the quiet of the night, your mind is auditing the transactions of the day, calculating who is owed and who owes you. Reciprocity, at its simplest, is the universal drive to return favors, gifts, or even perceived slights. Biologically, it was a necessary survival mechanism, a silent guarantee that cooperation within the tribe would yield future returns. Psychologically, it transforms a gift into an IOU. When someone gives you something, even a simple compliment, an unexpected piece of information, or a cup of coffee, they are subtly gaining leverage. They aren't asking you for a favor yet, but they have already established the necessary condition for one, the deficit. This principle is exploited in everything from high-stakes negotiation to casual dating because it relies on our deeply ingrained societal aversion to being perceived as a mooch or a parasite. Imagine the classic experiment. A research assistant gives a participant a soda during a brief intermission. Later, that same research assistant asks the participant to buy raffle tickets. The participants who received the free, unsolicited soda bought significantly more tickets than those who didn't. The actual cost of the soda was negligible, maybe 50 cents, but the psychological burden it created was substantial. The feeling of being ahead in the ledger is unbearable for the average well-adjusted human mind. You are constantly seeking balance, often overpaying the debt, even when the initial exchange was never requested or consciously noted. It's the anxiety of imbalance that compels us. The paradox of reciprocity lies in its beauty and its inherent ugliness. True altruism is rare, often masked by the unconscious expectation of return. The strategic operator understands this. The most powerful favors are those that feel spontaneous and utterly generous. Delivered with a smile and zero overt expectation, they gift you time, attention, or resources, creating a psychological deficit that they know you will be compelled to resolve. This initial act of seeming generosity is designed to ensure the recipient feels compelled to overpay the debt when the time comes. The conflict isn't just external, it's the internal fight between your desire for fairness and your chilling awareness that you might be locked into a transaction you didn't agree to. The tension heightens when you realize you can't simply reject the initial gift without appearing rude or ungrateful. effectively locking you into the subsequent obligation. Look at your digital landscape. Social media is built entirely on manufactured reciprocity. You are prompted to like, share, and subscribe as returns for the content provided, reinforcing a cycle of mutual, low-stakes obligation. In your professional life, the manager who spends 15 minutes genuinely listening to your concerns, providing unexpected emotional validation one afternoon, might just be setting the subtle emotional stage to ask you to work through the entire weekend the next. Emotional reciprocity is even trickier. We tend to overshare private details with those who overshare with us, believing we are building intimacy when we are often just building mutually assured vulnerability, a powerful, often dangerous form of debt. Understanding the physics of reciprocity is a profound psychological shift. It forces you to scrutinize every interaction. Is this a genuine offering, or is it an investment designed to maximize future returns? The philosophical implication is that pure, unconditional giving is nearly impossible in strategic social systems. Once you see the mechanism, you gain the power to consciously accept or reject the debt. You learn to recognize the unsolicited soda and decide whether the burden of future payment is worth the current benefit. The cost of freedom sometimes is the willingness to feel momentarily impolite by refusing a gift, thereby preserving your optionality. The highest form of strategic power is not demanding favors, but making others desperate to owe you. Remember that silent ledger. Every transaction you enter into, every perceived kindness is logged. You are either the banker or the debtor. And silence in the world of human debt is the highest interest rate. The labyrinth of doubt. The deepest silence is not the absence of sound, but the moment you realize how much you have chosen not to say. This brings us to the core concept of calculated uncertainty, the principle of strategic ambiguity. You are programmed to chase certainty. When you look at a problem, a relationship, or a contract, you seek borders, definitive answers, and the safety of the explicit. This desire for clarity feels like security. Yet every time you fully define something, every time you draw a hard line or make a definitive statement, you are not building a wall of protection. You are carving out a trap door. You have given away your leverage in exchange for temporary psychological comfort. Ask yourself, what is the quiet cost of defining everything always? Strategic ambiguity is not merely indecision, nor is it dishonesty. It is the disciplined art of managing the definition space. It is the conscious choice to deny others the data they need to predict your next movement, calculate your true limit, or identify your vulnerabilities. In any human interaction, whether it's a high-stakes negotiation or a casual conversation about future plans, the other party is seeking cognitive closure, the desperate need for a firm answer to quell the internal anxiety of the unknown. Your power lies in refusing to grant that closure prematurely, or sometimes refusing it entirely. Imagine yourself as the map maker standing at the edge of the known world. The average person feels compelled to fill every blank space with imaginary mountains and rivers just to feel complete. But the strategist understands the profound advantage of the unmapped territory. Leave that blank. Let the observer speculate about what resources, defenses, or armies might reside there. Their anxiety will populate the void far more effectively than any committed statement you could ever make. If you publicly state, "My absolute limit is $100, the negotiation begins at $99. If you maintain strategic ambiguity, the other side starts negotiating against their own internal projections, sometimes offering $150 just to find out where the real border lies. This exposes the central paradox. Your brain, striving for efficiency, rewards certainty. But strategic survival punishes predictability. The conflict is internal. When you refuse to commit, you feel the unsettling hum of unresolved tension, the psychological need to tie off the loose ends. This tension, however, is a resource. When you can tolerate the uncomfortable feeling of, "I haven't committed yet," while everyone around you is begging you to define the relationship, define the scope, or define the budget, you retain maximum optionality. The strategic player recognizes that commitment is expensive, And certainty is a commodity to be traded, not given freely. You are forcing the other party to operate in the labyrinth of doubt, a maze you designed, while you navigate by the known constants you keep hidden inside. This mechanism plays out daily. Consider the professional who never explicitly states their career ambition, but moves with quiet, accumulating force. Everyone assumes they are aiming higher than they actually might be because the true target remains undefined. Think of the relationship where one person avoids the explicit definition, not out of malice, but because the refusal to label maintains maximum freedom of movement and keeps the other party subtly investing to earn that label. When you are asked, "What exactly do you mean by that?" the most powerful strategic response is often not clarity, but further, slightly modulated ambiguity, creating another loop in the labyrinth. The ultimate psychological impact of mastering strategic ambiguity is liberation. You stop operating reactively against stated facts and start designing the environment of the unknown. You shed the burden of having to be consistently clear and instead embrace the discipline of being consistently flexible. The true freedom is realizing that you do not need the comfort of resolution. You do not need to know the next 5 moves because the power is in making everyone else believe you do know, while maintaining the capacity to choose any of them at the last possible moment. You learn that the clearest statement is often the one you choose not to make, and that the greatest strength is found not in eliminating doubt, but in transferring it. The labyrinth of doubt is not a place you get lost within. It is the structure you impose upon the competition. Sleep on this. You are most powerful when you are undefined. And sometimes the most strategic answer you can give is simply, "We'll see." If you're still listening, you're part of the few who want to understand, not just hear, hit like, "You've earned this point." The chemistry of admiration, the Adoration Gambit. This is the concept we dissect now, peeling back the layers of genuine respect to examine the strategic calculation beneath. Consider this quiet moment, just before the full descent into sleep. The mind often rehearses the social landscape, running simulations of who matters and why. Why do we choose who we admire, and why does that choice feel so intensely personal, almost chemical? It's rarely about pure virtue, it's about access to an emotional resource or a necessary proximity to perceived power. The chemistry of admiration is not the simple appreciation of merit. It is, more accurately, the negotiation phase of envy. When faced with someone who possesses a quality, a status, or a leverage you covet but cannot immediately seize, your mind performs a necessary psychosocial pivot. True envy is corrosive and isolating. It forces confrontation, and confrontation carries risk. Admiration, conversely, is proximity maintenance. It's the highly adaptive strategy of staying close enough to study the mechanisms of their success, hoping the residual magic or the strategic advantage might rub off on you. Historically, this mechanism kept societal structures stable. You admired the chieftain, not just because he was strong, but because his success ensured your temporary safety and continued inclusion in the circle. The deep historical resonance is that admiration is a subtle form of tribute paid in exchange for the promise of vicarious elevation. Picture the lighthouse effect. You are a ship navigating a vast, dark sea. You don't admire the lighthouse because you love the architecture or because you are fascinated by the quality of the light bulb. You admire it because it is emitting the only light source that can save you from crashing into the rocks. Its function dictates its reverence. The admired person is the psychological lighthouse. They illuminate a path or a possibility that you desperately need confirmed for your own journey. They prove that the summit is reachable. The moment that person ceases to guide or offer potential access to power, the admiration quickly wanes. If the lighthouse goes dark, you don't mourn the light. You immediately scan the horizon for the next beacon, adjusting your alignment swiftly and ruthlessly. This introduces the central paradox of deep admiration. You are simultaneously worshiping a possibility of yourself, a projected future where you hold that status, while deliberately embracing a position of voluntary subordination in the present. This voluntary hierarchy is what releases the chemical reward. When you sincerely laud another's success, When you articulate their greatness, you are signaling to your own subconscious that you are aligned with the winning team, drastically reducing the internal stress of competitive failure. Dopamine and oxytocin flood in, not because you are close to a good person, but because you are close to a recognized source of social power. The internal monologue shifts from, "I failed," to, "I am studying success." You convert the paralyzing energy of shame and frustration into the fuel of aspiration, masking the underlying competitive tension with genuine-sounding praise. It is a brilliant, self-soothing maneuver. In the modern landscape, particularly the curated digital space, the chemistry becomes highly volatile. We are exposed to thousands of lighthouses, all flashing brighter than they truly are, their status constantly broadcasted. Admiration turns into a consumption model. You follow success, trading your most valuable resource, your attention, for their carefully packaged trajectory. But the mechanism remains ancient. The more flawless the projection of success, the stronger the chemical bond of admiration, because the flawless image promises a guaranteed map out of your own current struggle. You are admiring the performance of power, which is far easier to replicate chemically than actual character. You buy into the aesthetic of control, hoping the confidence is contagious. The true psychological impact lies in the internal cost. Every time you redirect your focus outward to admire the sustained success of another, you are withdrawing investment from defining your own independent path. You borrow their status, feeling momentarily elevated by their presence, but this borrowed light always leaves you colder and darker when they depart. The critical strategic shift is to move from admiration as proximity seeking to admiration as blueprint analysis. The goal is not to become their shadow, nor to mimic their style, but to understand the fundamental, repeatable principles that allowed them to build their structure, their leverage, and their success. When admiration is rooted in genuine curiosity about mechanism rather than emotional dependence on outcome, the bond breaks and the power returns entirely to the self. The true chemistry of admiration is simply recognizing your own potential reflected in a stronger mirror. The trick is to stop polishing the mirror and start building the architecture it reflects. The performance ends when you realize the only strategic alignment that truly matters is the one you forge with your own silent, demanding ambition. The clock of strategic patience, the grand illusion of urgency. Have you ever felt that intense, almost painful pressure to act, to send the email, to make the move right now, that internal tremor that demands immediate resolution? And have you later, perhaps weeks or months down the line, realized that silence, that calculated inertia, would have been the most devastating, elegant weapon you possessed? Tonight, as the world slows, we explore the psychological geometry of strategic waiting, the force known not simply as patience, but as sovereign delay. Strategic patience is the highest discipline of power, because it requires you to defy the fundamental human compulsion towards immediate gratification and noise reduction. It is the intentional withholding of a decisive move until environmental variables, the pressures, flaws, and impatience of your opposition, have maximized the probability of your success. Strategic patience understands that time is not merely a linear measure of progress. It is a psychological lever designed to be operated against those who rush. Consider the metaphor of the unmoved stone. Two players are engaged in a crucial, high-stakes negotiation. The first player, driven by quarterly targets and internal anxiety, throws out offer after offer, rushing to fill every silence, attempting to force the closure. They are the river, exerting immediate, visible force. The second player is the stone. They offer minimum resistance, they hold their position, and they allow the river to flow around them. They listen to the frantic activity of the rushing party, observing where the banks are weakest, where the water is wasting its energy. The first player burns their resources, their goodwill, their proposals, their leverage, while the unmoved stone expends nothing but focused observation. The victory goes not to the party that moved fastest, but to the one who waited until the opponent exhausted their own strategic options. The core mechanism here involves a deep conflict between the limbic system and the frontal lobe. The limbic system screams for immediate threat mitigation. It demands action because inaction feels like risk. It creates the physical feeling of restlessness, the tapping foot, the itch to intervene. Strategic patience is the practice of overriding that primitive panic. It requires you to calculate the difference between the cost of haste and the cost of delay. Haste creates immediate, irreversible consequences, narrowing your options and forcing you to live with suboptimal outcomes simply because you couldn't tolerate the tension. Delay, however, expands your options. It allows others to expose their weaknesses and, most importantly, it weaponizes their natural impulse to panic. They fear the vacuum you create. They fill it with concessions. In the modern world, dominated by instant communication, constant feedback loops, and the intoxicating dopamine hit of doing something, strategic patience is an almost revolutionary act. We are trained to measure productivity by activity, regardless of effectiveness. We feel guilty if our inbox is quiet or if we haven't checked the market every 5 minutes. The person who practices sovereign delay intentionally removes themselves from the tempo set by the herd. They recognize that constant accessibility is a strategic vulnerability. They let the notification badges pile up while they synthesize the true signal hidden within the digital noise. The shift this initiates within your psychology is profound. You cease being reactive. You are no longer merely responding to the urgent demands placed upon you by external noise. You begin to respond only to the rhythm of reality itself, the necessary speed required for true leverage to manifest. You gain the ability to internalize complexity and let variables resolve themselves without your interference. This makes you unreadable, a silent gravitational force in any environment. You become the quietest person in the room and therefore the most consequential. You realize that power is often less about what you do and more about what you refuse to do. The universe rarely rewards the quick. It inevitably rewards the precise. Learn to measure your time not in seconds but in strategic opportunities. The clock is running, but only for those who panic. For you, the waiting is the action. The paradox of total control. We arrive now at the fundamental friction point of human ambition. The paradox of total control. If you find yourself lying awake tonight, running endless scenarios, asking yourself if you missed one single variable, one word, one necessary piece of leverage, you are grappling with this paradox. It asks a deeply uncomfortable question. What if the most effective strategy for managing your world requires you to deliberately step back and relinquish the illusion of absolute control? The paradox suggests that in any sufficiently complex and dynamic system, be it a relationship, a business, or your own internal emotional architecture, attempting to achieve 100% control results in 0% flexibility. Total control is achieved only by eliminating variation, randomness, and independent agency. But it is variation that makes life resilient, robust, interesting, and ultimately self-sustaining. The pursuit of perfect certainty is therefore the quickest, most direct path to guarantee stagnation and brittleness. To truly understand this, we must shift our perspective from the strategist to the architect of entropy. Imagine you are attempting to cultivate a miniature ecosystem inside a sealed glass terrarium. You carefully control the light, the temperature, the water cycles, and the soil composition. You achieve what looks like perfect order, a beautiful static equilibrium. But because the system is perfectly controlled and totally sealed, it cannot adapt. It lacks the internal mechanisms to deal with unexpected disorder. If a single microscopic shift occurs, a tiny crack in the glass, a persistent bacterium, the entire system collapses instantly, precisely because it has no practice negotiating change. Your perfect system is tragically brittle. We seek control because we crave the comfort of predictability. We want to draw a map where every curve, every obstruction is known and neutralized. But the mechanism of true influence does not operate by freezing the landscape. When you attempt to control a person, or a process, or even a deep-seated emotion, you are essentially trying to freeze a highly dynamic system in place. You force a single rigid outcome. When that outcome is achieved through force, your influence effectively ends, because the system is now completely dependent on your constant, strenuous, forceful maintenance. The energy required to sustain total control always, eventually, exceeds the energy required to simply guide the system naturally and observe its inherent tendencies. You cease to be a leader or a partner, and you become a jailer. The thing you control, even if it is a personal habit, quickly becomes a crushing burden. Look at the world around you and identify the patterns. The micromanaging leader who inevitably creates widespread incompetence. The parent who builds codependence instead of competence. The partner who stifles growth in the name of loyalty. In every scenario, the controlling party attempts to eliminate external risk, but inadvertently centralizes and transfers all risk directly to themselves. They become the single point of failure in a system that demands diffusion. Modern strategic thought recognizes that real, sustainable power is distributed power, the capacity to set intelligent parameters, establish clear boundaries, and then trust the self-organizing chaos that occurs within those allowed limitations. The true psychological shift required is the recognition that genuine influence isn't about the what, the specific, rigid outcome, but the how, the intent, the framework, and the capacity for response. You must stop trying to steer every molecule of the unpredictable ocean and instead focus entirely on building a ship robust enough and with enough supplies to handle the inevitable storms that are not in your control. This acceptance of essential randomness is not a form of surrender. It is the highest form of strategic patience. It's the profound difference between forcing a key that breaks off inside the lock and finding the precise, minimal technique required to softly engage the internal tumblers. The deepest silence is not the absence of sound, but the deliberate permission for certain sounds, certain variables, to pass unimpeded. Recognize that the hand that releases the rope is often the hand that saves the climb. True mastery is the careful art of managing inevitability, not the self-defeating delusion of eliminating it. The mirage of freedom. The greatest trick systems of power ever played was convincing us that freedom is the endless accumulation of options. We call this phenomenon, in the quiet observation of human patterns, the cage of unlimited options. Have you ever noticed that the moment you have infinite choices, you feel less sovereign, not more? That heavy, quiet anxiety that settles when the world tells you you can be anything, go anywhere, choose anything. Yet you feel perpetually paralyzed by the weight of possibilities. That tension, that soft hum of anxiety, is the sound of the mirage shimmering right in front of you. It is a fundamental trap of modern strategy. The mirage of freedom is not the absence of chains. It is the cunning substitution of visible constraints with internalized obligation. It is confusing abundant access with genuine liberation. We are free, yes, but free only to pick the flavor of the leash, while the architecture of the enclosure remains unseen, built not of steel bars, but of debt, expectation, and constant optimization. In strategy, this is known as manufactured agency. We are given the feeling of being the primary driver, ensuring that when the outcome is unsatisfactory, the responsibility falls squarely on our shoulders. You could have chosen differently. This psychological maneuver is crucial because it ensures that discontent is channeled inward toward personal failure, rather than outward toward systemic structure. Consider the simple yet profound illustration of the shopping mall or the modern streaming service. You stand before 1,000 choices, movies, products, lifestyles, and you spend hours engaging in the active labor of selection. You feel busy, you feel empowered because you are using your agency, but your engagement only serves the system's primary objective, to keep you consuming within the established boundaries. Your freedom is limited to selecting the precise niche within the predefined ecosystem. You are free within their rules, but fundamentally constrained by the necessity of continuous selection. This is the crucial paradox we must deconstruct. True control is not exercised by limiting your options to 2, but by limiting your environment to 1. The true strategist doesn't fight your will. They simply build the walls slightly taller in the directions they don't want you to wander, while leaving vast, illuminated, heavily trafficked paths in the directions they prefer. Strategy, in this context, is not about manipulation. It is about architectural design, creating a world so rich with choice that the effort of stepping outside the designated blueprint becomes prohibitively exhausting. The vastness of the choices serves as a fog, obscuring the few true constraints that define the system itself. Look at the relentless momentum of modern life. We are free to be entrepreneurs, workers, travelers, or creators, but only if we accept the non-negotiable prerequisite of constant hustle and productivity. You are free to choose the trajectory, but you are never free from the requirement to move at all times. The moment you pause, the mirage fades, and the silent gravitational pull of the underlying structure becomes visible. In the digital sphere, you are free to explore any rabbit hole, but the algorithm, the ultimate architect of agency, ensures that your path is optimized, predictable, and catering to established patterns. Your perceived freedom is merely the efficient aggregation of your data points, streamlining your trajectory inside the predetermined tracks of profitability and engagement. The greatest psychological burden of the mirage is exhaustion. We are constantly optimizing minor choices that don't actually move the needle of our destiny, draining the reservoir of will needed for the foundational choices that truly define us. We become brilliant micromanagers of trivial daily decisions, what to watch, what to buy, what to scroll through, and in the process, lose sight of the macabre reality that we have outsourced the large structural decisions of our lives. The realization of this shift is powerful. It teaches us that sovereignty lies not in demanding infinite possibilities, but in intentionally and fiercely rejecting 90% of what is offered, creating meaningful constraints of our own design. When the lights are dim and the world outside is quiet, remember this distinction. Freedom is not the absence of boundaries, it is the authority to draw the line yourself. The most dangerous chain is always the one you believe you willingly chose. True personal strategy begins when you stop exhaustively choosing the options presented to you, and instead start questioning the fundamental architecture of the game itself. The silent rules behind power are often hidden in the illusion of your own agency. The ultimate Machiavellianism, the invisibility of true control, the ultimate Machiavellianism. You understand the rules of the game, but have you ever considered the rules of the umpire? Settle in. The deepest form of power doesn't demand respect, it just assures compliance. Machiavelli taught us that it is better to be feared than loved, if one must choose. But the ultimate evolution of this doctrine moves past fear and love entirely. It enters the realm of predictive neutrality. Ultimate Machiavellianism is not about being a tyrant. It's about engineering a system where your desired outcomes appear inevitable, natural, and even desired by those you guide. It is the difference between forcing a river to change course and simply building the banks that channel it exactly where you need it to flow. This is not crude manipulation. It is structural environmental design. It is the power of the inevitable. Imagine a masterful chess player, not focused on the next 3 moves, but focused entirely on shaping the opening scenario so fundamentally that 40 moves later, every possible pathway leads back to a checkmate he already calculated. The board feels vast and open to the opponent, full of choices, full of perceived freedom, but every choice is a pre-calibrated funnel leading toward a single predetermined point. This is not visible strategy, it is structural strategy. The true power player doesn't have to push buttons or issue commands. They design the circuit board, ensuring that the machine, when turned on, performs exactly the function they intended without any further intervention. The most powerful control is the control that does not look like control at all. The central paradox necessary for this level of mastery is profound detachment. To achieve this quiet control, you must sacrifice the egoic need to be seen controlling things. The novice manipulator needs the fanfare, the visible display of leverage, the moment where the target finally admits defeat. The ultimate Machiavellian seeks anonymity, They operate purely through incentives and constraints, making the victim genuinely believe they chose the path freely, that the outcome was an organic result of their own actions. This requires immense internal discipline, emotional neutrality in the face of organizational chaos. When you are truly powerful, you are simply the calmest observer in the room, because you already know the final scene of the play being performed around you. Your conflict is managing the internal temptation to interfere or gloat, realizing that interference only proves your own fragility and reduces the elegant illusion of inevitability. The system you built must run on its own logic. Look at modern life through this lens. This concept applies less to explicit political theater and more to the subtle architecture of your career, your relationships, and the curated environments you inhabit every day. Who is designing the incentives that define your goals? Are you chasing the prizes they placed on the track? Or are you looking at the person who owns the track and set its geometry? In your own life, how often do you react to events? And how often do you proactively structure your personal environment so that negative events become functionally impossible, or at least strategically useful for the next phase of your development? It demands constant, exhausting vigilance against reactivity, a focus on designing the system rather than playing within it. The deep philosophical weight of this pursuit lies in the loneliness it often requires. To see patterns this clearly is to separate yourself from the immediate, emotional, chaotic flow of everyday human interaction. You become an external consultant to the human condition, even when observing your own behavior and your own reactions. The reward is tremendous functional security and predictive certainty, but the cost is the loss of spontaneous, uncalculated connection. When every interaction, every relationship is filtered through the lens of strategic potential, what part of your authentic, undefended self remains accessible, even to you? It forces the painful recognition that predictability is the necessary enemy of genuine surprise, but the ultimate guarantor of safety. The true master strategist doesn't merely win the battle. They simply define the field on which all battles must be fought. The deepest power is the power you never have to use. Rest now and observe the silent architecture of your own desires. The seduction of controlled chaos. The principle we examine now is the subtle magnetic pull of controlled instability, the precise moment where the competent strategist stops fearing entropy and learns to harness it. It is the deep, dark pleasure of the conductor who realizes they possess the power not only to direct the melody, but to introduce the necessary destabilizing dissonance. How much turbulence do you need in your life to ensure you are actually paying attention? Before you close your eyes tonight, consider the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the most secure position is not achieved through perfect calm, but through the deliberate yet temporary introduction of risk. We are fascinated by the edge because it is only at the edge that we truly measure our own balance. This is the psychological strategy of engineered disruption. It's the art of letting the rope slip slightly, not to fall but to test the tension, to see exactly where the breaking point lies for others or for yourself. This technique is practiced by executives seeking to restructure, negotiators aiming for leverage, and even children testing the boundaries of parental limits. It relies on the certainty that if you do not occasionally probe the limits of the system, you will never know its true strength or its true dependencies. Controlled chaos is not true destruction, it is a high-stakes diagnostic test. Imagine the complex infrastructure of an advanced security system. The most robust security measure isn't the wall that never moves or the camera that never blinks. It's the mandatory weekly fire drill. The drill, while appearing chaotic, sirens blaring, people hurrying, temporary shutdowns, is an intentional, localized disturbance designed to verify the response mechanisms and reveal the hidden vulnerabilities of the operational protocol. If the system fails during the controlled test, the real failure is averted. If you never test the alarm, you only assume the batteries work. True power, in this context, is the exclusive ability to choose when and where the alarm rings. You are the one holding the test button. The core conflict in applying controlled chaos is the absolute requirement of faith in your own capacity for recovery. You must be willing to walk to the edge of the cliff just to observe the effect of the sudden wind on your followers or your competitors. The mechanism works primarily through uncertainty fatigue. When others are forced to constantly adapt to minor, unpredictable shifts you introduce, a sudden change in priorities, a random, high-pressure reevaluation, a calculated withdrawal of support, they burn significant cognitive and emotional fuel responding to your noise. This dynamic leaves them with less energy to challenge your core agenda or question your fundamental motives. They become focused entirely on stabilizing their immediate environment, accepting your overarching authority as the only constant in the localized storm you generated. They seek shelter, and you are the roof. Observe this principle applied in modern social dynamics. The person who is always perfectly predictable, whose schedule and emotional responses are mathematically legible, is rarely the one who holds true emotional gravity. Calculated absence. The sudden silence after intense connection, the unexpected shift in attention, these are micro-instabilities. They force the other person to fill the void with interpretation and projection, often unintentionally reinforcing your value. In the business world, it's the sudden pivot in public strategy that forces competitors to chase a moving target, exhausting their cash and their focus, while you secretly maintain relentless, stable focus on the unchanging, long-term goal. The chaos is the necessary decoy. Philosophically, embracing controlled chaos frees you from the tyranny of Newtonian order, the belief that everything must proceed linearly, predictably, and without friction. It shifts your perspective from being a nervous conductor desperately trying to silence the orchestra to becoming a skilled composer who knows that the most profound emotional movements require dissonance, tension, and release. The true psychological impact is the transformation of fear into a tool. You stop fearing disruption because you start leveraging the sheer predictability of human reaction to disruption itself. You understand that disruption is not an accident, it is a resource. You do not seek stillness, you seek the mastery of movement. Remember that the surest way to measure the depth of the water is to cast a specific stone and watch the ripples it creates. Power is not the absence of chaos, but the exclusive right to choose the size of the stone and the precise moment of its drop. The magnetism of indifference. The magnetism of indifference. It is a concept we encounter long before we are equipped to name it. A silent rule woven into the fabric of human strategy and desire. You have certainly watched this dynamic play out, maybe even felt its sharp sting. Why do the people who appear to crave connection the least often become the gravity centers in any room, while those who aggressively pursue approval seem to float weightlessly on the periphery? The emotional hook is the anxiety of visibility. You are constantly told to put yourself out there, to engage, to be seen. But the hidden truth is that availability depreciates value. We are not talking about genuine apathy, which is simply a lack of energy, but a cultivated state of strategic indifference, the calculated demonstration of non-reliance. It is the awareness that your internal ledger of needs is balanced, irrespective of external input. This non-reliance creates a vacuum that others instinctively try to fill, because human nature finds nothing more compelling than that which refuses to be compelled. Consider its definition. The magnetism of indifference is the mechanism by which perceived self-sufficiency elevates social currency, transforming attraction from a pursuit into a natural consequence. It operates on the principle of scarcity, not of presence, but of reaction. When you withhold the automatic expected emotional response, the quick validation, the anxious reply, the immediate accommodation, you introduce a friction that forces the other party to question their own standing and increase their investment. Imagine the classic illustration of two figures standing on the edge of a great sweeping river canyon. The first figure is holding a rope, desperate for the other to take hold, pleading for connection, defining their entire identity by the acceptance of that gesture. The second figure stands slightly back from the edge, hands resting calmly at their side, watching the river flow. They are not rejecting the first figure, but they signal, without saying a word, that the rope is entirely optional. Their stability is rooted in the canyon floor beneath them, not in the fluctuating agreement of another person. Who, in that moment, possesses the true power? Who becomes the object of focus and the standard of stability? It is the one who requires nothing. Now let us deconstruct the mechanism. The indifference attracts because it implies a high degree of internal resource. You are signaling that your well is full, and therefore any attempt to connect must be driven by the other person's interest, not your desperation. This generates a specific type of anxiety in the observer, the anxiety of the unmet challenge. People are often drawn not just to what they can possess, but to what proves difficult to obtain. Your lack of visible need forces others to supply the energy, the enthusiasm, the chase. It inverts the power dynamic instantly. The pursuer becomes the supplier, and the indifferent becomes the valued commodity. This indifference is often misinterpreted as arrogance, but psychologically, it is experienced as integrity, a refusal to bend your core state for external validation. In the context of the present, this rule dictates how we manage our digital identities, our professional negotiations, and our romantic lives. The delayed text message, the absence from the predictable social circle, the quiet confidence in a business meeting that refuses to over-explain, these are all modern expressions of strategic non-dependence. You are communicating through silence and measured withdrawal that your time and attention are finite, valuable resources. You are not running away, but you are not waiting either. This quiet occupation with one's own path, regardless of ambient noise, makes others feel compelled to step into your orbit. The psychological impact of cultivating this state is profound. It forces a fundamental change within you. To genuinely project indifference, you must first achieve actual self-mastery. The moment the indifference becomes a performance masking true need, the mechanism fails, the act becomes transparent. Therefore, the strategic adoption of non-reliance demands that you actually become the self-sufficient entity you project. It is the practice of internal validation, the philosophical acceptance that your value exists independently of external mirrors. This frees immense mental energy previously wasted on seeking approval and redirects it into genuine purpose. The ultimate power resides not in controlling others, but in mastering your own capacity for desire and response. When you can look upon a highly coveted object, position, or relationship and truly realize, that you can be complete without it, you have achieved leverage that cannot be bought or negotiated. The strongest attractor in the human world is not charisma or beauty, but the profound quietude of someone who has nothing left to prove. The greatest magnetic force you can wield is the deep, settled stillness of wanting nothing from anyone. The power is the silence that follows a declaration of independence, whether spoken or simply felt. If you reach this point, it means you don't run from the truth. Subscribe now. Stay close to what few dare to face. The calculus of necessary betrayal. Look closer at the shadows behind your most trusted alliances. When you look at the structure of any long-term partnership, whether personal, professional, or strategic, you are not looking at fidelity. You are looking at delayed competition. The greatest strategic question you will ever face is always this: is the price of loyalty currently higher than the cost of defection? This is the premise of the calculus of necessary betrayal. It's not about malice or sudden fits of anger or an emotional lapse. It is about entropy applied directly to social bonds. It is the realization that every cooperative structure is inherently temporary, held together not by abstract concepts like love or shared values, but by a current, mutual utility that outweighs the individual benefit of dissolution. When that specific equation shifts, when the geometry of power changes beneath your feet, betrayal ceases to be a moral failing and becomes the most rational, and often the only, strategic move left. It is simply a clinical divestiture of a failing strategic asset, executed before the asset completely compromises the future of the operating entity, you. Imagine the classic game theory scenario, the prisoner's dilemma, expanded over decades. You and your partner have successfully cooperated 99 times. You have both benefited massively. But suddenly, an exogenous shock, a market crash, a political shift, a health crisis, or the revelation of a deeply hidden fact introduces a brutal asymmetry. One of you now possesses a hidden move that ensures their complete survival and exponential security, but guarantees the immediate and complete collapse of the other. The calculus now demands you betray the history of collaboration to secure the future of the individual unit. The logic isn't "I hate you." The logic is far colder: "I must survive," and our current entanglement prevents that. Therefore, the entanglement must be severed. This is where the true psychological tension resides. The emotional brain, trained by society, screams for fidelity, integrity, honor. But the strategic brain whispers the truth. Survival is the highest form of integrity. The mechanism that makes this betrayal necessary is the shift from a perceived state of abundance to a realized state of scarcity. In abundance, we can afford morality. We can afford the luxury of maintaining inefficient alliances simply for comfort or sentimentality. But in true scarcity, scarcity of time, opportunity, capital, or influence, morality instantly becomes a luxury that compromises our fundamental directive: persistence. The necessary betrayal is almost always preemptive. You do not wait for your partner to defect. You defect the nanosecond you perceive, with reliable data, that the cost of carrying them or the risk of their future actions outweighs the value of maintaining the bond. You are not waiting for proof of their disloyalty. You are calculating the future probability of their failure and deciding whether you can afford to ride the collapse down with them. The greatest tragedy, from an external perspective, is that the necessary betrayal often looks exactly like simple, vulgar greed or treachery, but inside the mind of the operator, it is often simply a quiet, clinical assessment of probabilistic outcomes executed with surgical speed. Look at organizational restructuring in the professional world, at the friend you left behind because their toxic baggage became too heavy for your personal or professional ascent, at the romantic partner whose goals stopped aligning with your trajectory. You rationalize these moves later to yourself and others as natural growth, different paths, or self-care. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was the calculus working beneath the emotional surface. You ran the numbers on the partnership, recognized the looming deficit or the approaching structural weakness, and executed the necessary extraction. This is how empires change, how fortunes are made, and how individuals transform their destinies. The ability to execute the necessary betrayal without paralyzing guilt is the single clearest indicator of strategic capability, divorced from the costly paralysis of sentiment. The true psychological toll is not the single agonizing act itself, but the preceding cold realization that deep down you understand that every alliance, every vow, and every cooperative structure is fundamentally conditional, temporary, and negotiable. You are forced into carrying a silent, continuously updated inventory of vulnerability for everyone you cooperate with. This knowledge compels you into a state of perpetual strategic readiness, where trust is not an easy feeling you grant freely, but a current measurable asset that must be rigorously stress-tested every quarter. It fundamentally changes how you sleep at night. You no longer dream of fidelity. You simply maintain your exit strategies. The most dangerous knowledge you can acquire is the precise moment when the hand you are holding becomes the anchor you must cut to survive the storm. Why silence is the true currency of power. You think power is the loudest voice in the room, the most aggressive assertion, the fastest retort. You have been taught that visibility and volume equate to authority. This belief is the first vulnerability recognized and exploited by true power brokers. The silent truth, the dark undercurrent of influence, is that true power never needs to shout, it waits. We are trained from childhood to fear the vacuum, in conversation, in relationships, in our schedules. This deep-seated discomfort with stillness is not incidental. It is a fundamental pattern the strategist leverages. Silence is the vacuum that your social environment rushes to fill. It is the refusal to expose your hand before the bet is absolutely necessary. It is the purest form of non-committal engagement, and therefore the ultimate defense. The currency of silence operates not through what it communicates, but through what it withholds. When you speak, you give away intention, emotion, and data points. When you remain silent, you force the recipient to engage in the exhausting and often revealing labor of projection. They have to guess your stance, your mood, and your next move. In that guesswork, they surrender their own strategic position. They become the actor, and you become the audience, the impartial, unreadable judge. Consider the classic setup of the high-stakes negotiation, or even the intense moment of interpersonal conflict. The unprepared or the emotionally compromised speaks first. They launch into explanations, justifications, and defensive maneuvers designed to fill the awkward space. They are driven by the fear of being misunderstood, or worse, the fear of the tension itself. But the master negotiator, the one with true leverage, sits across the table. They offer a simple, heavy weight, nothing. They provide no immediate reaction, no affirmation, no rejection. They simply observe the other party expending energy. Who is truly under pressure? The one talking, constantly leaking anxiety and information. The silent person has already won the first phase of the war, the information war. The paradox of strategic silence is this. In human social dynamics, we interpret the absence of speech not as neutrality, but as loaded judgment, profound contemplation, or even superiority. The moment you clamp down on your impulse to respond, the other person's mind does not accept the void. It generates possibilities, often negative ones, aimed at immediate self-correction or appeasement. They become desperate for your input, your approval, or anything that breaks the tension. They will overshare, over-explain, and expose their underlying anxieties simply to achieve equilibrium. The lack of data forces them to manufacture it, often pulling from their own subconscious fears and vulnerabilities. You haven't asked a single question, yet you know everything you need to know about the depth of their commitment and the location of their breaking point. Think about how this applies to the relentless churn of modern communication. We live in an age of instantaneous reply, where not answering a text for 30 minutes is treated as an act of calculated hostility. This reliance on immediate validation makes us Pavlovian subjects to the notification chime. Strategic silence is the digital detox of power. In your personal relationships, when a disagreement erupts, the instinctive move is to defend, counter-accuse, or escalate. But try the absolute opposite. Absorb the accusation, hold it, and offer nothing back but sustained, focused attention. The accuser, suddenly deprived of the expected friction and the external validation of the fight, often dissolves their own argument simply by trying to keep it running against zero resistance. They find themselves debating against their own echo. Mastering silence means mastering the self. It demands the profound discipline to resist the dopamine hit of the immediate response, the impulsive need to clarify or justify. It is a commitment to seeing the entire board before moving the first costly piece. Psychologically, silence elevates you from a reactive participant in the immediate chaos to the detached observer who controls the stage lighting. It forces you to tolerate internal discomfort, the urgent, itching need to speak, and realize that your momentary comfort is infinitely less valuable than their strategic exposure. You cease reacting to the drama. You start directing the scene by merely standing still. The true currency of power is not found in gold or in words, but in the calculated, profound silence you refuse to fill. The person who speaks last, or better yet, the person who speaks only when absolutely necessary, is the one whose words carry the undeniable weight of necessity. When you finally choose to break the stillness, remember this: the cost of your silence has already been paid by the listener. Let them understand that every word you withhold is an asset you retain, and every piece of stillness you maintain is a price they pay. The architecture of invisible fences. We are speaking tonight about the architecture of invisible fences. How often do you find yourself stopped, not by a physical wall, but by the memory of a wall? That subtle psychological hum of "I am not allowed here," that deep, internal sense of limitation that dictates your movements before any external force intervenes. This is the system of silent rules and constraints you internalize long before confrontation is necessary. This is not the explicit law or the written contract. It is the infrastructure of preemptive surrender. These fences are built from social conditioning, past rejections, perceived status gaps and the generalized fear of consequences, a fear so pervasive and efficient that it renders the physical enforcement mechanism largely obsolete. They are the phantom limbs of authority governing your ambition, your reach, and your silence. They define the limits of what you believe you are ethically or socially permitted to possess, say, or achieve. To understand how insidious this architecture is, consider the classic social experiment of the flea circus. If you place a flea in a glass jar and secure a lid, the flea learns rapidly to jump only as high as the ceiling allows. Its internal programming calibrates to the imposed constraint. Now remove the lid. The flea, conditioned by the invisible boundary, will continue jumping to the precise height where the glass used to be. It has adopted the ceiling. The jar is gone, but the fence remains, imprinted on its neurology. This is the invisible architecture, the constraint that outlives the context, the limit you enforce upon yourself long after the warden has walked away. The paradox inherent in power dynamics is this: true strategic command often resides not in building stronger, higher physical walls, but in making others believe the walls exist, or, more powerfully, in making them build the walls themselves. Those who operate at the highest levels of influence rarely need to issue explicit threats. They simply maintain the illusion of distance, the predictability of consequence, and the historical weight of status. You, the conditioned subject, instinctively do the heavy lifting. You self-censor the risky request. You preemptively dilute the ambitious proposal. You choose the smaller, safer slice of territory because the perceived cost of testing the boundary feels overwhelmingly high. The deepest tension of your life lies in the gap between what you can do and what you have decided you may do. We police ourselves with the shadows of past failures, projecting yesterday's refusal onto tomorrow's opportunity. Look at your professional life, your negotiation stance, or your capacity for intimate vulnerability. Where have you installed invisible fences? Did you decline the promotion because the path felt too exposed? Or did you accept a lower price because the silence on the other end felt too heavy to challenge? The modern world is saturated with these subtle boundaries, the algorithms that fence off information, the financial gatekeepers that define acceptable risk, the social scripts that harshly punish deviation from the expected norm. We live in a landscape where most aggression against your own potential is preemptive and tragically self-inflicted. The profound psychological impact of the invisible fence is the surrender of potential without ever having fought a single direct battle. It shifts the burden of proof entirely onto you. You must prove the fence is not there, while the architecture of society constantly affirms that it is. The moment you recognize the absence of the authority, the moment you see that the jar is definitively open, you gain a terrifying and absolute responsibility. Freedom is less about physical movement and far more about the psychological courage to jump higher than your own deeply embedded conditioning permits. When you feel the familiar resistance, when you feel the pinch of that invisible barrier, pause and ask yourself this single, critical question. Is this resistance enforced by reality, or is it merely remembered by my nervous system? Sleep now, but let this thought echo in the deeper, more vulnerable parts of your mind. Most of the limits you faithfully obey were retired years ago. You are simply following instructions issued by a ghost. The weight of unspoken agreements. We call this the doctrine of implicit reciprocity, the weight of unspoken agreements. Have you ever felt utterly betrayed, yet you couldn't point to a single broken promise? You knew a line was crossed, but when you tried to articulate the violation, the words fell flat, sounding petty or illogical. That sinking feeling, that moment when someone violates a rule that was never written down, never discussed, but which you believe to be the absolute foundation of your relationship. That is the weight of the unspoken agreement asserting itself. These are the silent social blueprints, the foundational assumptions about fairness, loyalty, roles, and anticipated sacrifice that underpin every complex human engagement. They are invisible contracts, necessary tools for efficient human interaction, regulating everything from marriage to multinational diplomacy. We cannot function if we have to explicitly define every micro-interaction. Trust allows us to delegate massive portions of our relational architecture to the implicit sphere. But the very moment we feel cheated or exploited, we are not reacting to a direct lie. We are reacting to the seismic shattering of an implicit agreement. The contract has failed because the terms were never shared. Consider the classic illustration of two partners bound by mutual dependence. Imagine two people pursuing a deeply challenging goal. One holds the map and the critical data. The other carries the shared supplies and the canteen of water. The unspoken agreement is simple. The cartographer trusts the carrier to share the water, and the carrier trusts the cartographer to guide them honestly and efficiently. They don't need a formal notarized document. Their survival depends on this silent, accepted balance. But what happens if the map holder starts rationing the directions, making the journey unnecessarily longer, increasing the suffering, thus draining the communal water supply faster? No explicit contract was broken. The map holder never promised a specific route duration. Yet the foundational trust is annihilated. The cartographer has exploited the carrier's dependence on their skill to extract more effort, violating the implicit agreement of mutual fairness. The violation feels total, precisely because it attacked the unwritten rule of partnership. The paradox of the unspoken agreement is that the stronger and deeper the relationship, the fewer explicit agreements are deemed necessary. We substitute shared history and assumed alignment for tedious clarification. We value this silence as a sign of deep connection, an indication that we are truly known by the other party. We believe, irrationally, that true understanding means never having to ask. But silence is also the most fertile breeding ground for resentment. We create a meticulous internal ledger where we track the favors given, the sacrifices made, the boundaries respected, waiting for the equally silent counterfavor or recognition. When the debt isn't repaid, and usually it isn't repaid in the currency we silently chose, we don't confront them about the debt itself. We confront them about their perceived moral failure, their lack of character, their selfishness. The true weight isn't the violation of the rule, but the realization that the other person was operating under a completely different, unshared rulebook the entire time. You see this mechanism at work every day. In your professional life, your implicit agreement is often that loyalty, long hours, and consistent over-delivery lead to upward mobility and recognition. Your organization's implicit agreement might be that long hours are merely the expected cost of employment, and loyalty is the minimum standard. The result is burnout and a sense of betrayal, where one party feels robbed of their anticipated reward. In personal life, how many friendships collapse, not over a single heated argument, but because one friend silently assumed the role of the perpetual counselor and the other assumed the perpetual protagonist who never had to listen until the role asymmetry became unbearable. Recognizing the immense, subtle power of the unspoken agreement changes our fundamental approach to conflict. It forces us to move past the immediate, self-righteous sting of betrayal and analyze the original, unarticulated premise. The goal shifts from proving the other person is wrong or bad to understanding where the two narrative scripts diverged. When you bring the implicit agreement into the harsh light of dialogue, you risk tension, yes, but you gain clarity. You gain the power to negotiate reality, rather than merely punishing someone for failing to read your mind or adhere to standards they never knew existed. It transforms a perceived moral failure into a remediable failure of communication. The most dangerous agreements are always the ones we sign without knowing the terms, or those we assume others have signed on our behalf. Go find the silence. Identify the rules you hold sacred but refuse to speak aloud. Let your clarity be louder than your assumptions. The necessary performance of weakness. Let's talk about the asymmetry of perceived threat. Have you ever noticed how the most powerful people, those wielding significant capital, influence, or authority, often deploy their own vulnerabilities with surgical precision? It's rarely accidental. It is, in fact, the highest form of strategic camouflage, a performance designed not to elicit sympathy, but to neutralize anticipated resistance. This is the necessary performance of weakness. It is the conscious, calculated reduction of your own perceived threat level, not because you genuinely lack competence, but precisely because you possess too much of it. In any high-stakes interaction, whether professional or deeply personal, the primary expenditure of energy for all parties involved is mitigating risk. If you are viewed as maximally competent, wholly self-sufficient, and entirely unburdened by human flaw, you trigger maximum defensive resistance. You become a perfectly polished pillar the environment must instinctively test and attempt to erode. The necessary performance of weakness, however minor, a carefully timed admission of being terrible with technology, a visible struggle with complex scheduling, a fabricated lapse in memory during a low-stakes discussion, serves as immediate social lubrication. It is the tactical decision to leave the door ajar just enough so that others feel they possess a necessary superior function in your presence. Consider the classic military feint, modernized for the boardroom or the living room. The ancient general didn't just attack where the enemy wasn't. Sometimes he deliberately showed a fragile flank, inviting the opponent to overcommit resources and focus their attention on a weakness that was designed to collapse only after the main force had mobilized and secured the true objective. In the modern context, think of the expert executive who begins a negotiation by admitting to being unfocused this morning or apologizing for their terrible skills with numbers while requesting the detailed financial spreadsheet. They are not bad at math. They are soliciting immediate patience, deflecting critical scrutiny away from their core analysis, and encouraging the opponent to lean in, confusing temporary assistance with actual operational control. The mechanism works because the perception of weakness activates two powerful human instincts simultaneously: altruism and the lowering of defensive walls. If I perceive you as completely self-contained, utterly perfect, I must spend all my resources defending my own boundaries completely. I seek the gap in your armor. If, however, I perceive you as needing my input, slightly flawed, or struggling with a relatable deficit, I momentarily drop my guard to offer assistance, empathy, or correction. This temporary suspension of skepticism and competition is the window you require. The psychological paradox is profound. Genuine, sustained power often necessitates hiding itself because raw, unfiltered competence creates immediate and overwhelming envy, resentment, and a relentless psychological need among peers to seek your downfall. To successfully sustain power, you must dedicate energy to performing the theater of relatability. This requires a significant internal calculus, sacrificing the immediate, ego-boosting satisfaction of demonstrating mastery for the long-term benefit of unobstructed movement and low-friction progression. Look at the architecture of modern influence and leadership. The pristine image is obsolete. The highly polished, flawlessly winning leader or influencer feels fundamentally alienating. What the audience, the subordinate, or the consumer truly craves is the carefully staged confession. The social media caption that admits to burnout, the televised interview detailing the struggle to find a perfect work-life balance, the perfectly lit photograph of the deliberately messy desk. These are seldom genuine moments of uncontrolled collapse. They are strategic openings. They allow the audience to feel superior, more balanced, or more human than the authority figure, even if only for a fraction of a second, binding them to you through engineered compassion. You are inviting them to participate in your humanity, which subtly shifts the dynamic from passive admiration, which breeds resentment, to active protectiveness, which breeds profound loyalty. The psychological toll for the performer lies in the necessary self-denial. To play this game successfully, you must become deeply comfortable with the sensation of being underestimated. You must absorb the gentle patronization that comes when others believe they are helping, guiding, or even correcting your feigned flaw. The deep philosophical question here is whether the continuous performance of a strategic deficit eventually creates a true deficit. Does the mask of necessary weakness eventually consume the strength beneath it? Not typically, provided the performance remains anchored in conscious strategy and not genuine need. The true danger is when you begin to internalize the need for external validation derived from shared vulnerability, confusing strategic empathy with genuine dependency. Strategic vulnerability is simply the shadow of true dominance. Remember, the sharpest knife often remains sheathed, dulling itself against no friction until the exact moment of necessity. Your weakness, when consciously chosen, is your strongest armor. The echo chamber of self-deception. The principle of necessary blindness. How many necessary lies do you uphold daily just to keep the structure of your life from collapsing? We often speak of power as the ability to command others, but tonight, we stop looking outward for the enemy or the competitor. We examine the architecture of the internal defense mechanism that guards your peace, the strategic decision not to know. This is where the highest stakes are played out, in the silent negotiation between what you know to be true and what you need to believe to continue functioning. Self-deception is often viewed merely as a failure of courage or intellect, a childish evasion, but it is, in fact, an advanced psychological tool. It is the sophisticated act of holding two contradictory beliefs simultaneously, consciously prioritizing the comforting illusion over the painful or paralyzing truth. It is the mind's calculated attempt to manage cognitive dissonance by constructing an internally consistent, though externally porous reality. The relevance of this idea lies precisely in strategy. The person who is successfully deceived by themselves is often the most convincing actor on the external stage, because they are not merely acting a lie, they are living a dedicated reality. Imagine your mind as a grand, sprawling archive, a library recording every event, every failure, every market shift, and every dangerous possibility you face. But you don't read the master ledger. Instead, you operate solely from a highly edited, personalized anthology. This internal editor is ruthless. Its primary directive is the preservation of momentum and self-esteem. It systematically excises any data point that threatens your narrative of competence, stability, or inherent goodness. When you consider a major pivot, a career change, a high-risk investment, or a confrontation, this editor ensures the files on past catastrophic errors are strategically corrupted or simply filed away under external factors. It's the mental safety mechanism that prevents analysis paralysis by ensuring you only see the green lights on the dashboard even when the engine is smoking. The deeper mechanism involves insulating the executive self, the part of you that acts, decides, and takes risks, from the observer self, the part that knows the objective data and calculates the odds. The executive self thrives on certainty and forward momentum. It needs an unwavering belief in inevitable success to push through resistance. If the observer self constantly broadcasts failure rates, structural weaknesses, and the genuine contempt of rivals, the entire system stalls. The mind, being highly efficient, prioritizes movement over accuracy. It generates strategic blind spots, specifically targeting areas where accountability or self-correction should reside. This process isn't accidental. It's an optimization of psychological resources designed to maximize immediate output. This mechanism is critical for survival in hyper-competitive environments. To become a high-level manipulator, you must first master the art of manipulation upon the self, forging an armored confidence that others mistake for objective certainty. In the hyper-optimized reality of modern professional and digital life, the echo chamber isn't solely derived from external algorithms. It is the internal algorithm you built to filter inconvenient metrics. The danger is that successful people, in particular, become exquisitely good at this filtering process. Are you measuring your progress by effort expended or by the actual verifiable outcome? Are you genuinely seeking critical feedback from true intellectual peers? Or are you simply scouting for validation from subordinates and sycophants? When you surround yourself with affirming mirrors, be they digital platforms or organizational structures, you are not confirming reality. You are maximizing your own inertia, often right towards a predictable, unseen cliff. The refusal to engage with contradictory evidence becomes a hallmark of your identity, confusing steadfastness with strategic denial. The profound psychological impact of maintaining this inner division is the slow, corrosive erosion of adaptive capacity. Self-deception grants profound short-term psychological stability, making today feel manageable, but it guarantees long-term systemic fragility. When the inevitable external shock arrives, the market shift, the strategic betrayal, the undeniable evidence that your assumptions were flawed, the carefully constructed narrative shatters violently because you lack the mental callus that genuine, continuous confrontation with truth provides. You haven't merely avoided the truth, you've lost the capacity to process it cleanly. True resilience is not the ability to ignore the storm. It is the verified knowledge that you've already charted every weakness in your own vessel and accounted for the flaws in your own crew. The comfort of the lie is always exponential until the precise moment the truth arrives. This truth often arrives packaged as a high-consequence failure. So, as you drift towards sleep, ask yourself not what comforting belief you hold dear, but what uncomfortable truth you are currently paying a high internal price in energy, relationships, or delayed action to forget. That quiet, subsidized cost is the blueprint of your immediate future. The strategy of being misunderstood. The strategy of being misunderstood. The art of the controlled blur. You know that feeling when someone seems infinitely more powerful because you simply cannot place them. They are a phantom in the room. They speak just enough to participate but never enough to be pinned down. This silence, this deliberate opacity, is often not incompetence or shyness. It is architecture. It is a psychological shield built of uncertainty. Tonight, as the world settles into its quiet patterns, we examine the strange gravitational force of the controlled blur and how powerful people sometimes choose the path of least clarity to maximize their influence. We are not talking about accidental miscommunication, the mundane failures of transcription or poor listening. This concept, the strategy of being misunderstood, is the intentional maintenance of ambiguity around one's true motivations, intentions, or capabilities. Its origin lies deep within the physics of social power. In any system where prediction is paramount, the unknown variable holds disproportionate weight. If the people around you cannot accurately calculate your next move, they must default to assuming the worst, or the most capable version of your potential. Historically, powerful figures, from legendary wartime generals to modern corporate leaders, understood that absolute clarity invites targets and limits options, while profound mystery invites deference and expands possibility. When you are perfectly clear, you are easily defined and therefore easily countered. The moment you intentionally allow yourself to become a complex, fluctuating variable, you force others to spend their finite energy and resources attempting to define you rather than pursuing their own objectives. You control the dialogue simply by refusing to finish your sentence. Imagine the master poker player who consistently bets without ever displaying a discernible tell or reliable pattern. Sometimes they bluff aggressively with a truly terrible hand, seemingly immune to loss. Other times they play conservatively with a guaranteed win, suggesting their caution is boundless. The crucial element is that they never allow the observation of their action to cleanly map back to their actual holding. They create noise and psychological static. The impact on their opponents is debilitating. They stop playing the cards they are dealt and start playing the player, a player they cannot possibly read. You are taking this principle and turning your entire persona into an unsolvable equation, forcing everyone around you to deal not with what you are, but what you might be. The paradox required to execute this successfully is demanding. To leverage misunderstanding as a tool, you must possess immense self-knowledge and iron control, yet project none of it. You must master the subtle arts of the non-answer, the half-disclosure, and the sentence constructed specifically to be interpreted in three equally plausible ways. The inner tension arises because our primal instinct is deeply wired toward connection. We want to be understood, to be seen clearly and accepted. But the strategist realizes that visibility is often a vulnerability, a point of attack. When you allow people to project their own desires, fears, and expectations onto you, They are essentially collaborating and creating a version of you that serves their immediate psychological needs. This strategy weaponizes the human tendency to fill informational gaps with convenient narratives, ensuring that you become a psychological mirror reflecting back whatever the other person is most anxious about or hoping for. In the modern context, this ambiguity is a core asset. It manifests in the curated social profile, not the one that brags openly, but the one that hints at unattainable knowledge, esoteric interests, or ambiguous high status. It's the entrepreneur whose vision is described using grand, yet deliberately vague terms. The politician whose core ideology seems to subtly shift depending on the constituency they are addressing. It is the constant, subtle avoidance of definitive commitment. When you refuse to state your absolute opinion on a high-stakes issue, the audience spends energy trying to recruit you to their side, rather than passing judgment on your position. You maintain independence, and therefore maintain influence by maintaining independence from rigid definition. The psychological toll on the self is the necessary sacrifice of genuine, effortless connection for the sake of strategic advantage. You exchange fleeting intimacy for enduring influence, but the resulting power structure is exceptionally stable. People stop seeking validation from you and start seeking validation of their own pre-existing interpretations of you. You are no longer truly judged by your actions or intentions. You are defined by the ever-changing interpretations of your audience. This grants an extraordinary, almost sublime freedom. The freedom to exist behind a meticulously constructed fog, where only the carefully controlled shadows are visible to those outside. To be perfectly clear is to be perfectly limited. Sometimes the deepest and most enduring power is found not in speaking your truth, but in allowing others to believe they already know it, while holding the real code close to the chest. The strategist understands that the most powerful voice in the room is often the one that chooses to whisper nothing at all. How trust becomes a lever. You believe trust is a soft exchange, a mutual shield against the uncertainty of the world. You see it as an emotional contract defined by loyalty and sincerity. But what if trust is not a shield at all? What if it is, in the hands of a skilled strategist, the sharpest, quietest lever in the entire mechanism of human influence? This is the calculus of calculated vulnerability. Trust is fundamentally defined not by the absence of deceit, but by the voluntary transfer of control. It means I have measured your stability, assessed your motivations, and deemed the risk of giving you power over my resources, my secrets, or my future acceptable, necessary even, to achieve a greater goal. We chase trust not because it offers immediate emotional warmth, but because it is the most efficient solvent for friction in complex human systems. It minimizes resistance. It allows for speed and scale. Historically, strategic trust, fiducia, was the invisible currency that financed empires and cemented political alliances. You don't trust the stability of the foundation. You trust the architect's competence to handle the resulting load. Imagine two mountain climbers roped together on a sheer, iced-over slope. The novice sees the rope purely as safety, a guaranteed fail-safe. The master climber understands the rope is also a continuous assessment of liability, a measured risk. If one slips, the other must anchor instantly, but the anchor only holds if the foundation of shared experience and verified skill is stronger than the combined weight of the potential fall. The true lever is the slack in the rope, the precise, measured space you allow for maneuverability. That slack grants speed, but simultaneously grants massive, instant power to the trusted party to accelerate the fall. Here lies the central paradox of the lever. Trust generates security, but that very security only exists because it has first created a critical vulnerability. The lever works primarily by exploiting the inertia of expectation. When trust is established, when the bond is believed to be settled and stable, our cognitive defenses drop. We stop measuring. We stop predicting betrayal. This is the precise moment a strategic mind recognizes the ultimate value, a pathway of least resistance into your core decisions. When you trust someone fully, you are, in effect, handing them the blueprint for your defensive architecture, the schematics of your boundaries. They do not have to fight their way in. You have provided the key codes, labeled the pressure points, and deactivated the perimeter alarms. The true lever is not pulled during the moment of the betrayal itself, but during the silent internal calculation that precedes it. The lever is pulled the moment the operator determines that the cost of maintaining the existing relationship of trust has become greater than the benefit of exploiting the vulnerability it has created. This calculation is often made in silence and always outside of your awareness. Think about the institutions and relationships you currently rely on without daily vigilance: your bank, the health system, the algorithms that curate your perception of reality, or your closest partner. Every piece of data you surrender, your history, your habits, your emotional weak points, is filed away. It is waiting to be operationalized. Modern life is defined by escalating trust transactions. We are constantly trading the burdensome freedom of absolute defense for the soothing efficiency of existence. You trust the system with your attention, and you trust the infrastructure with your mobility. The fundamental change that occurs when you understand this mechanism is the realization that radical self-reliance demands radical distrust of easy answers, yet radical distrust paralyzes action. The genius of the leverage dynamic is that it forces you into action. It moves you from a state of static independence to a dynamic, leveraged codependence. The psychological impact is the constant, low-level hum of realizing that every act of faith you perform is a deliberate increase in someone else's capacity to influence, if not outright dictate, your outcome. It changes how you view reciprocity, not as a gift or a mutual exchange, but as a calculated investment in your eventual influence or your defense against theirs. Sleep on this weight. The one who trusts least often holds the longest lever, because they have already priced the cost of the bond's inevitable collapse into their initial strategy. The rituals of strategic forgetting. We begin tonight with a concept that seems paradoxical, yet governs the fastest minds and the deepest reservoirs of power: the rituals of strategic forgetting. Do you know the weight that the right kind of memory places upon you? The burdens of ambition are often not defined by what you fail to recall, but by what you actively decide to retain. Close your eyes and ask yourself, what old resentment, obsolete victory, or traumatic mistake are you clinging to tonight that is actively slowing your present trajectory? Strategic forgetting is the cognitive act of deliberately purging high-cost, low-yield data. It is the disciplined removal of emotional residue attached to past decisions, past failures, or the irrelevant successes of rivals. It is not amnesia. It is mental triage. In the world of high-stakes play, whether in business, strategy, or the disciplined pursuit of self-mastery, your decision space must be surgically clean. Clutter is commitment. Commitment is friction. This ritual requires recognizing that sometimes the memory itself becomes an obstacle, a phantom limb that aches, dragging your focus into a time that is already concluded. Consider a high-level executive or a military commander reviewing a devastating strategic defeat. They must process the facts of the failure immediately, brutally, and without compromise. But then, they must perform the ritual. They take the raw data, the loss of capital, the failure of analysis, the personal humiliation, and they strip it of all emotional resonance. They archive the lesson, the why it failed, and they strategically burn the narrative, the how it felt. The commander's mind does not forget the facts. It strategically forgets the crippling pain and the lingering self-doubt that prevent future necessary risks. You are not forgetting the past. You are decommissioning an obsolete emotional asset that draws power away from the present operation. The mechanism of strategic forgetting is not denial. Denial is a lazy defense. Strategic forgetting is, ironically, an aggressive focus on the future state. The tension lies in the paradox. True mental discipline is measured not by how much information you can perfectly hold, but by how expertly you select the necessary few things to discard. You are consciously preventing neural pathways from hardening around negativity. Every time the ghost of a past mistake appears, you do not engage in a psychological battle against it. You simply and immediately redirect your attention to the next immediate necessary action. This is the difference between learning a lesson and building an entire identity around a failure. The one frees you to move, the other ensures your emotional and strategic burial in place. In your modern, saturated life, this ritual is essential for survival and advantage. You are constantly bombarded by the staged successes, engineered perfection, and archived highlight reels of others. Strategic forgetting means purging the narrative of what you should be doing based on someone else's optimized trajectory. It means purging the obsolete blueprints of a career or a relationship that died years ago but still demands mental rent. These ghosts of possibilities and old expectations are heavy. If you desire to move with speed and agility, you must learn the deliberate cruelty of traveling light. The deepest impact is psychological speed and continuous optimization. When you strategically forget the surrounding trauma and self-recrimination, you grant yourself the ability to iterate rapidly. Failure ceases to be a traumatic event that requires months of self-pity and recovery, and instantly becomes a single, sterile data point in a continuous experiment. You gain a ruthless efficiency in resource allocation, and the most finite resource is your attention. This ritual transforms psychological resilience from a passive defense mechanism into an active, offensive strategy. It makes you unburdened by history, ready to pivot, and available for the immediate truth of the moment. Remember this as you drift toward sleep. Your mind is not a passive warehouse of all events. It is an active factory of future action. And the master strategist knows that the greatest power does not lie in what they choose to perfectly remember, but in the deliberate, forceful grace of what they choose to let beautifully disappear. Sleep now, and forget only what is necessary. The fading light of moral exceptions. The most dangerous concessions we make are not to our adversaries, but to ourselves. This is where the boundary truly collapses, in the quiet, personalized space we reserve for what we call the moral exception, the one-time, necessary, contextually warranted detour from integrity. Have you ever drawn a line in the sand, a boundary you swore you would not cross, only to wake up the next morning and find your foot already halfway over the edge? Not because you were pushed, but because you convinced yourself the rules of the previous day simply did not apply to the exigencies of the present one. This initial slippage is almost never framed as a moral failure. It is framed as strategic flexibility, or sometimes grim necessity. The fading light of moral exceptions describes the insidious psychological process where an intentional, localized breach of personal ethics becomes normalized behavior, eventually blurring the original, high standard until it is functionally invisible. We teach ourselves through repetition and internal narrative that integrity is not a universal constant, but a conditional luxury dependent entirely upon convenience. The exception is the narrative you build around a violation to protect the image of the violator, yourself. It is the internal memo justifying why this time, the foundational principle you rely on for self-respect, must temporarily yield to outcome. Imagine your integrity as a vast, meticulously maintained glass house. Allowing a moral exception is like permitting one specific window pane to be broken, insisting that the rest of the structure remains perfectly sealed. You tell yourself, this one hole is necessary for ventilation, or it's a slight flaw, but the house is otherwise sound. But the moment you permit that crack, you establish a new architectural precedent. The system now knows. The structure is penetrable if the perceived immediate need justifies the cost. The air, the rain, and eventually the dust of subsequent greater compromises will flow through that initial fissure. The mechanism of erosion is powered by cognitive dissonance reduction. When you commit an act that conflicts with your self-identity as an honorable person, your mind seeks to resolve the tension. The path of least resistance is almost never to halt the profitable or convenient action. Instead, you revise the rule. You don't change your behavior. You change the standard. You begin by bending the light of conscience just enough to cover the exception, but in doing so, you permanently dim the standard itself. The conflict dissolves not because the action stopped, but because the internal objection was retracted. The light doesn't just fade, it shifts, becoming a justification for the new, darker terrain. Consider how this plays out in modern life. The professional who grants themselves a small exception to inflate a quarterly report, promising to correct it next cycle. The partner who grants themselves an emotional exception in a private chat, claiming it's just harmless venting. In that moment of justification, you are not merely taking a shortcut, you are rewriting the constitution of your inner life. This normalization is sped up in the digital age, where ethical violations can be compartmentalized behind a screen and labeled a momentary lapse of judgment, reducing the exception to an accidental metadata error rather than a deliberate choice. The true psychological impact is the permanent fragmentation of the self. By accumulating moral exceptions, you create a self that is structurally weak, defined less by its principles and more by its escape clauses. You become obligated to constantly lie to the ideal self about the actual self's actions, leading to a state of internal vigilance where energy is expended not on high performance, but on maintaining complex, fragile alibis. This loss of internal clarity, the constant recalculation of where the line used to be, is the true cost of that initial, small exception. You lose the silent, powerful simplicity of having an unyielding standard. The moment you permit the moral exception, you effectively revoke the moral law. Be wary of the necessity you feel in the darkness, for the exception you make for convenience today is the standard that will govern your choices forevermore. The light, once dimmed, requires extraordinary effort to burn bright again. If you made it this far, you're part of a small circle of restless minds. Comment, I know the secret. We'll recognize each other there.